Welcome, welcome. We're so excited that you're all here for what is going to be a spectacular talk. I'm Patricia McDonald, director of the Ulrich Museum of Art, and we're all here to hear Kerry James Marshall, but I have two quick things that we need to do in advance of that. And first things first, I really need to say a thanks to the different sponsors and donors who make exhibitions like our Gordon Parks retrospective possible and make it possible to bring art stars like Kerry James Marshall to Wichita. So the lead exhibition sponsor is Commerce Bank and the William T. Kemper Foundation. Kerry's presentation and the array of different programs that we've done in conjunction with this exhibition have been supported by the Kansas Humanities Council. Additional exhibition support was generously given to us by Ted and Marcia Ayers, Joseph C. Lukens, Mike Roach and Anna Kelly. Thank them, they're at the back of the room. Harvey Sorensen, Marty Stevens, and the law firm Martin Pringle, Oliver Wallace, and Bauer. At the Ulrich, we actually have two advisory boards or advisory councils, and one of them is the Alliance, a great group of community people who help us organize various events and go out of their way to help us throw out the welcome mat when we have distinguished speakers from elsewhere come to town. And out of their own initiative and out of the goodness of their own hearts, a good number of years ago, they started a project to offer scholarships to students in the School of Art and Design at Wichita State University. So this was entirely something of their own doing and thinking, and that money comes because they pull out their checkbooks and write checks. And we have an awardee for this year, and I thought it would be great if I haven't even introduced Kerry, and yet I'm going to use him already. Come on up, Kerry. And actually, I should acknowledge that Trish Higgins, who's the president of the Alliance, is in the back over here. So we have some people from that group who are here with us. We have a scholarship award certificate, drum roll please, and this year the Alliance scholarship goes to
Megan St. Clair. Well, congratulations, Megan.
There we go. All sorts of fun at the Ulrich, giving out, great money to good art students, right? So now I want to turn to Kerry James Marshall and an introduction. Working in art museums has many, many charms, and it's a special bonus for me when I get to welcome an artist of the stature of Kerry James Marshall to Wichita. We've invited Kerry here in conjunction with our current exhibition and retrospective on Gordon Parks. And, to be honest, I've been trying to dream up a reason to get Kerry James Marshall to Wichita ever since I arrived on the scene. So we sort of finally found an excuse, and yet there are really profound connections between the works of Gordon Parks and Kerry James. As we were thinking about the different kind of programs that we wanted to develop in conjunction with the exhibitions, I felt it was important to have a contemporary artist and have an artist who is continuing a tradition in which Gordon Parks was part and himself made a very important contribution. And Kerry was just a great candidate for that very tall order. On the one hand, we marvel at the many art forms that Gordon Parks involved himself in and took on. Yes, photography, of course, but filmmaking, and he choreographed a ballet, and involved in music composition, and and just so many different art forms. Well, in Kerry James Marshall, we have a painter. Kerry's primarily a painter, but he also takes photographs. He creates art installations. He's involved in filmmaking, both as a director and as a production designer for films. Some of you may be aware of the fact he's done comic books as well, sort of epic comic books. So there was that connection. But I would say most importantly, Kerry's work confronts and tests social issues and social consciousness in many of the same ways that Gordon Parks did. He asks his viewers questions, and you will see sometimes quite uncomfortable questions about racial identity in America today, and challenges our assumptions in that area. He explores contemporary experience, but he then layers those subjects and compositions with a wealth of knowledge of art history as well. And, that was a touchstone for Parks. You'll see him talk tonight about his eagerness for African Americans to have a presence on the walls in art museums, and that too has been part of his overall strategy. So, all of that is going to become very evident as we get Kerry up here to talk. Kerry was born in Birmingham, but he moved to Los Angeles sort of in grade school years. He now lives in Chicago. He has a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the Otis Art Institute. Nicely, his alma mater brought him back in 1999 and gave him an honorary degree. He has taught about 13 years and became a full professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago. He's been a featured artist at such international expositions as the Venice Biennial, the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, the Carnegie International Documenta that is in Kassel, Germany. He received the coveted MacArthur Foundation Award in 1997. That's also sort of sometimes called the Genius Award. So we have Kerry James Marshall Genius here this evening. He's exhibited here, there, and absolutely everywhere. In 2003, the Museum of Contemporary Art organized a retrospective for Kerry that then toured the country. In the United States, he's shown work in New York, Boston, Miami, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, as well as in sort of those smaller markets of Philadelphia, Columbus, Minneapolis, Boise, Seattle, and we shouldn't leave out Antwerp and Berlin and London and Basel and Ottawa. And now we can add Wichita to that list because we've acquired a print of Kerry's, and it's presently in our Amsden Gallery. And Overland Park in Kansas, he's got just a stupendous oil that's there, and one in the Nelson Atkins as well. So Kerry is, I find, just an extraordinarily impressive human being who happens to be an artist of the highest caliber. The title for his talk this evening is John Brown's Body, the Representation of Black Bodies as Revolutionary Gesture. Please help me to welcome Kerry to the stage.
Oh.
Take it away.
Wow. I said, what was Amy sitting there for? I thought you were going to say something.
Oh, no, I just get to be the mic person.
Well, thank you all for coming out. And you know what, I have to, Amy was asking me, do you ever get used to these introductions when people are making these things? Because people are saying such glorious things about you. And I said, no, not really. Because it's funny, because it's traumatizing in a way to have people sit up here. And I always think, I got to figure out a way to tell people to stop priming the pump ahead of time. Because when people say things like spectacular, we're going to have this great event, we're going to have this, now I'm sort of on the spot. And I've got to deliver probably at a level that I might not be capable of performing at. So be patient. So anyway, welcome you all. And I think the way I'm going to start, we're going to go on a wild ride, I guess, in a way. And we're going to start from the title of the talk, which is, at least to me, I think, is a kind of provocative title. John Brown's Body, the representation of black bodies as a revolutionary gesture. And the reason, and those two things together, I think, have a parallel relationship to each other. Because if, for the people who, and I'm sure there's probably not a person alive who doesn't know who John Brown is and what John Brown did, and that when John Brown first began his campaign as an abolitionist, he began here in Kansas. and then moved on to Harper's Ferry, where everything sort of collapsed and kind of went horribly wrong. But it was it was the motivation, the idea that in order to make the kinds of significant transformations that need to occur in any social order, and in my case, in any aesthetic order, that it requires some sort of radical, revolutionary, and provocative act in order to realize the kinds of changes and transformations one has to affect. Because as John Brown would say, it's like the status quo is unacceptable. And so the status quo as the United States as a slaveholding country was unacceptable, and unacceptable enough for somebody to believe that the kind of negotiated, peaceful kind of process that a lot of the other abolitionists were engaged in was simply not sufficient. That if you really wanted to get something done, as John Brown said, you need action, 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 not talk. And so for me, as an artist, when I began to imagine myself being an artist, I'm just like everybody else who falls under the spell of image making, where you see the things you encounter in the art history books, and then when you're first introduced to the museum, for me, taken there on a field trip with my elementary school, where you see things in the museum and you see things in these books that are they're really magnificent works. They're really fantastic things. And they are so impressive as to be completely inspirational. And the thing that you come to learn is that the question of how people decide that they want to be artists, so what determines for people that being an artist is what they want to do? Where there used to be this notion that people become artists because they have this need to express themselves, and the visual arts or painting or music or whatever it is happens to be the form that is best suited to them being able to express themselves. But I never really believed that self-expression was the motivating factor. In fact, I don't think making art has anything at all to do with self-expression. Although self-expression might be a byproduct of the activity once you engage in it. But what people really do, and the reason why people really want to become artists, is because they want to be a part of the narrative of art, the pantheon of artists, the great artists who had made work before them. So all artists everybody who wants to make art makes art because they saw work that somebody else made that's made them say, I want to do that too. And so when you enter into this sort of relationship with the history of art, then you start to understand that it is the relationship between all of those things that were made before and how your work speaks to the relationship to those things that came before, that is actually at the heart of, and that is actually the essential the essential component to what it means to make art. And when you look at what artists are trying to do, what you're actually trying to do is to find a way to put yourself at the end of that lineage so that when the next chapters in the story of the narrative of art are being told, that your name is among the name of all of those people that you had come to admire when you began on this sort of path. So that was, for me, the challenge was to try to find out first what it was that the artists that I was looking at in the books, and you know all the names from Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael and Degas and Monet and Manet, what it was that those artists did that made them so central to the narrative of art, and what do you have to do in order to match the achievements and the accomplishments that they affected in order to become a part of that narrative yourself. And for a young African-American kid growing up, one of the first things that you encounter when you go to the museum is largely an absence of the representation of black figures or people that look like you as a part of that. So the pantheon that you're trying to break into as a part of your interest is a pantheon that in which you don't see yourself represented. And because you don't see yourself represented in that pantheon, you actually have no understanding of what the pathways to getting in that would be. Because you can't simply take it for granted that just because you made work, that the work is somehow going to find an audience, and that it's going to be interesting enough, and that it's going to be meaningful enough for people who run institutions like the Spencer where I just was, like the Ulrich here, or like any of the other museums that you encounter in the country. You have no idea what the people who are operating those places are using as a criteria to determine that the things they have there are the things that are worth being there. And so when you have no mechanism like that, then you've got to figure out, you've got to either go on faith, or somebody has to introduce you to what the stakes are in the larger game so that you can then develop a strategy for helping you get there. And that's what the art school is supposed to be for. The art school is not just a place where you can go and sort of hang out and do stuff that you like and be around your friends so that everybody else can tell you they like your stuff too, make you feel good about yourself. That's not what the art school is supposed to be for as far as I'm concerned. What they're supposed to be for really is to set the terms that would allow you to be fully competitive at the highest level that the game is being played. And at the highest level at which the game is being played, what's at stake is nothing less than the transformation of people's perception and understanding of what kinds of things constitute works of art and what kinds of things change the perception of the audience who comes to see museums, so that the things that they thought constituted works of art are now their parameters are expanded. And so when we look at the way the formal developments of the art world sort of march through time, you can see how from medieval painting, and we'll just talk for the moment about the sort of Western European tradition, how from medieval painting through the Renaissance and the High Renaissance, through the Baroque, through the Romantic, through the Rococo, through all of those things, through Classicism and Neoclassicism, all the way up to modernism, where you had surrealism, you had futurism, you have Dada, you have all of these things that artists did. And the motivation for doing those things and the motivation for all those transformations is constantly asking the question, what constitutes or what can be or what is a painting? What is a sculpture? What is a drawing? And then the fundamental question, what is art? And that question of what is art was completely overturned in a lot of ways by Marcel Duchamp back as late as 1914, between 1914 and 1917. When, as Marcel Duchamp said, an artwork is anything that a person who calls himself an artist signs his name to. It requires no particular skill, requires no special knowledge, no particular vision, none of those things. You could simply go to the hardware store, as he did, buy a snow shovel, buy a urinal, buy something, put your name on it, sit it on a pedestal, and there you have a work of art. I mean, and that's a radical gesture. And in fact, that gesture was so radical that even the radicals, the Society of Independence at the time, that was too radical for them. So they had a lot of trouble dealing with that. But what that opened up in terms of possibilities for artists after that has been a tremendous arena of activity and operations, in which now it gets harder and harder and harder to make that kind of a radical gesture. So anyway, so this is me and John Brown, two radicals. And for me, the most radical thing I could think of to do as far as the art world and the art museum was concerned was to figure out, and the thing that I think would have the most profound transformative effect on the field at large, was to introduce into that field the images of black figures in a manner that allowed them to operate on the same level, at the same scale, and with the same intensity as the work that was already in the museum. So when you go to the museum, let me say I'm going to show you another image after John Brown. And this is going to be sort of relevant to the conversation too later on. But this is an image of a man named Dangerfield Newby, who was one of the black men who was with John Brown at Harper's Ferry when they went to try and capture the armory there. And he was the first man in the group who was killed because he was at the bridge outside Harper's Ferry as a kind of a lookout, just to make sure they were able to get their work done before the townspeople were alerted. And Dangerfield Newby had a profound effect on me as well, in part because when he was killed, a letter was found in his pocket from his wife, who was a slave on another plantation. Dangerfield Newby had been freed by his master, who was his father, and he was going to try and raise enough money to be able to buy his wife and kids from the other man, and then they would go on and build a life for themselves. But a couple of circumstances transpired, which, first of all, he couldn't raise the money, and then her owner had changed the terms. He had agreed to sell them for $1,000 before, but then he raised it to $1,500, which was going to make it even harder. And the letter that she wrote to him was asking him to really hurry up and come and to buy her as soon as he can, because her master, she said, was having financial problems and was probably thinking about selling them off down further south. And she couldn't tell when, so she wanted him to come as early as possible. But the thing about Dangerfield Newby that interested me as well was the fact that he was the free black man who had already gotten on the other side. And you have to always wonder what it is, and in this case it seems clear enough, that would make a free person who had been enslaved put everything on the line, take the risk of going back to engage in an action that was, if you had thought about it a little bit, you could have known was doomed to failure from the outset. But to try and help to free some other people who hadn't made it on the other side. And the thing is, like, this was 1859 when the Harper's Ferry raid took place. But what a lot of people don't understand about the way slavery was operating in the United States, even as early as the 16th century, there was slave revolts from the get-go. There never was a time when there was this sort of easy sort of dominance where people who were enslaved were sort of accepting of the situation they were in. There never was a time in the entire history of the United States when that was the case. There always were slave revolts from the beginning. The first one that I read of was called the Santo Rebellion. It was in North Carolina in 1649, I think it was, where 100 black men who were slaves tried to mount an insurrection, and they thought they would be able to work their way down to Florida, because Florida at the time was still in Spanish hands, so they thought maybe they would be able to make it down as a small militia. But of course, there were 100 of them, but they were easily overtaken by townspeople and militias once the word got out, and so they were all captured and killed. So, but that's the thing. So this whole notion, on one hand, a lot of people say that John Brown's raid was one of the precipitating factors of the Civil War. But every slave revolt that took place from the beginning and up until then was a precipitating factor. And you can look at the impact, if we think about the way Haiti exists in the world today. The fact that the Haitians won their freedom from France in a slave insurrection in 1808, well, that put everybody on notice in a way that the potential for that kind of insurrection was too dangerous for them to be able to tolerate. And so more and more and more repressive kinds of laws and regimes were sort of set into place to minimize the possibility that that kind of an insurrection could ever take place. And it's actually Thomas Jefferson had imagined that, that at some point they might have to get rid of all these Negroes in the United States. And if they were going to have to do that, they might be able to send them all to Haiti to get them off their hands because they didn't want to have to be bothered with all this revolt. But anyway, so this whole notion of putting it all on the line it's a critical idea, because in the art world, if you think about it, with a massive and magnificent history behind us, like here in the moment that we arrive, where we're imagining ourselves to be significant in some way and to produce work that really matters, the ground on which that kind of potential is possible is getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. But it gets smaller and smaller and smaller as the classes of people who start going to art school are getting larger and larger and larger. So it's like you have to be so sharp, in a way, and so distinct. Because if you are not, then you fall into that mass of undifferentiated people who are making work that is somehow useful to the system in one way or another. Because there are lots of university galleries, there are lots of commercial galleries, there are lots of places that have programming that they have to fill all year round. So, and it's not always filled with the best stuff that's being made. Sometimes it's filled with stuff that just seems that is useful enough to fill up a space. And so if you want to figure out some kind of way to distinguish yourself from everybody else who's making work, then that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. So let's go past Dangerfield Newby. And I made this painting. This is from 1984 or so. And it's a painting. It's called Oh Dear Dangerfield, which is, it's after the opening lines in the letter from his wife that was found in his pocket. It's called Oh Dear Dangerfield. And it's a black-on-black painting with the kind of funerary flowers at the top. But the silhouette of that building there is the silhouette of the National Guard Armory at Harper's Ferry. And so we'll go past that. So, and here we are at this moment. This is like when you think about the history of art, this is what you expect to see when you go to the museum. I mean, these are the kinds of paintings we like. And these are the kinds of things we see when we go to the museum all the time. Oops, one too many. So, and you've seen everybody who took Art History 101 or modernist art history. You saw all of this stuff before. So these are the kinds of things you see all the time. And then in popular culture, there's the great American pinup. This is a great book, actually, if you've ever seen it, that Taschen puts out. But and these are, and the thing is, like, there's nothing wrong with these things. They are all fine. They are all fine, except that in all of these cases, when you go to the museum, the things you expect to see all look like this. When you pick up this pinup, but there's not one black figure in that entire book on the Great American Pinup. In the museums, often you will go through the museum, you won't see one painting that foregrounds or centralizes the image of a black figure. And we take it for granted when we go to the museum that that is what it's supposed to look like. This is what art is. And we don't have any problem going to the museum and not seeing representations of other people other than white or Western Europeans. We don't have any problem with that. But when I go to the museum, that is an incredible problem for me. Because even though I like the things that I see when I'm in the museum, I'm still haunted by the absence of or the lack of representation of figures that look like me. And so and all people want to be associated with things that are considered to be great and things that are considered to be good. And if you're never seeing yourself in a position where you consider to be like that, then that can be a problem. And so for me, the thing that I thought would have the greatest impact in transforming the expectations that people have when they go to the museum is to start to introduce into that museum images that were undeniably black. Oops. We'll get to that another time. So anyway, There was a period, I went through a period which I hope everybody here who really wants to be invested in the art world, I hope everybody who is trying to become an artist is doing this thing, where what you really want to know is how pictures work, how paintings work, not just the kinds of paintings you like, but all kinds of paintings. So there is no formal device that an artist can use that you should not be able to use and understand how it functions best from the inside out. And so all the time you spend in school, you only spend that time doing exercises because you don't make art when you're in art school. You only do exercises when you're in art school. And the exercises you do while you're in art school are designed to familiarize you from the inside out with the function of all of the methods that are available to an artist to make an image or to make an object. You just need to know how these things work and how to optimize the value you can get for the kind of thing that you want to make. That's what the whole thing about art school is all about. It's not, you can't make art. You don't start making art until 5 or 6 years, 7 years, maybe after you graduate from school. When you finally started to figure out a way to synthesize all of those things that you learned into a form that you can take ownership of and claim to be your own. So for me, I was doing a lot of abstract work, doing a lot of collage work, doing a lot of prints, doing a lot of drawing, doing a lot of different kinds of things because when you make collages, there's an incredible wealth of information about how composition works that you can gain from making collage. You learn about how shape operates when you're making collage. So that's the usefulness that collage has. And if you want to do figurative collage, well, you can do figurative collage. That way you get to move figures and shapes around without having to keep redrawing the figure over and over and over again. So the flexibility that you get from using cut paper images gives you a lot of chances to play with things so that you can get more and more and more information out of it. If you're doing abstract work, really, what are you trying to learn? You're trying to learn how surface, how texture, how density and transparency, how all of those things work and the kind of effect they have on the picture overall. That's what you're trying to do. That's why you make abstract work. You learn how rhythm and how dynamics of picture space and all of those things work. That's what you're trying to do. And you're only doing that stuff because you're calculating, or at least calibrating, the effects that any kind of a gesture, any kind of a mark you make on a page, the kind of effect that has on the space overall. So after doing a lot of abstract work for a period, and the first work I started showing actually was these sort of small abstract collages that I was doing. But then I started to realize that I needed more than just that. And the first image I did after working on collages for a period was this painting called The Portrait of the Artist as a Shadow of His Former Self. And it's a very small painting, but it's an egg temper painting of all things. So you take a 13th century medium, and I use the formulas and the techniques, everything from the Cennini treatise on egg tempera painting. I used all of that information, and I made a painting that took advantage of all of the compositional devices I learned from high Renaissance painting. But it doesn't look anything at all like a Renaissance painting. And this was one of those first moments in which I was completely self-conscious about the kinds of thing I was trying to do. And when I came up on this black figure, started painting these black figures against a black background, so this notion of visibility and invisibility was an issue that I was trying to deal with. And it had a lot to do also with the way Ad Reinhardt and the black paintings that he was making was playing with those same ideas of visibility and invisibility. And this notion that Ad Reinhardt had made, when he made the black paintings, that he was painting the last paintings that could be painted. And so I started working with imagery in black-on-black paintings. And so that's the first one. I did this in 1980, so that was 30 years ago. And that painting there led directly to all of the kinds of paintings that I was doing, that I'm doing now. And that one of the things, we'll come back to that too. So I'll proceed from here. So this notion of a kind of radical representation of the black body, the black figure, Because the truth is, like, I don't think I've ever been in a museum in which I've seen this is a 7-foot tall painting. It's 5 foot by 7 feet. I don't think I've been in a museum anywhere in the world in which I've seen a black figure painted in a museum that was that big and that was that direct. And so images like that are startling to people when they come into the museum and encounter them. And in this case, it's more startling because the figure is painted in absolute black. And so it's like no matter what context these figures are found in, the figure itself is always painted black because it functions as a rhetorical device within the picture field. That the blackness of the figure is not only real in terms of the fact that it is just black paint, but it's real in the sense that it's rhetorically the way we define ourselves in some cases as black people. And so in this is a part of a pair. There are two painted. You could almost call it a diptych. But this is Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein. And they're two straightforward, larger than life size black figures. And the notion is like in this idea of Frankenstein, it's sort of critically and conceptually important to what you see. And that's important in part because if you think about what a black American is, the black American is an invention of European colonial imperialism. So we are not self-defined or self-made. We were brought here by somebody else. We didn't buy a ticket. And the parameters of the kind of identity we could establish were determined in large part by the degree to which the kind of oppressive structure around black people was either harsh or less harsh. Because there were rules of identity that the system imposed on black Americans. One of which was to make sure that you had people from different groups or from different places on the continent of Africa mixed up with each other so that they couldn't communicate as well with each other as they would if they were people from the same tribe. So they systematically try to strip away whatever identity they had before. You have people sequestered away on these plantations, and it never really dawned on me until I did a project at San Francisco at SF MoMA based on Mount Vernon and Monticello. So you get George Washington's estate and Thomas Jefferson's estate. And I hadn't really paid a whole lot of attention, but if you look at Monticello is about, I mean, I'm going to probably lowball this, but I think Monticello is 800 acres. And when you look at an aerial view of Monticello, you see it's like if you were a slave working on the Monticello plantation, that whole world was Monticello. Because you can't see outside of that. And you certainly weren't able to go outside of that on your own. You didn't walk around just sort of, let me go to the corner up here and see what's going on down the way. No, you didn't go out of that. So you were confined to a world in which all of the rules were set for you within the confines of that plantation. There was no neighbor next door that you could talk to. So you couldn't even compare your situation to the situation of people who were on the plantation next door. Because you didn't have there was no way you were going to encounter those people. And so your whole identity was sort of overdetermined by the circumstances that you found yourself in. And so this is why, so you have the kind of identity that black people are trying to create for themselves in the United States is all made up based on assumptions about who we want to be more than on assumptions about who we actually are. Because family connections were always disrupted. Cultural patterns were either forbidden or had to be done in secret. I mean, all of that stuff had something to do with the kind of people that black people became today in the United States. And this is not, and these are all things that had to be negotiated in relationship to an overwhelming dominant force and structure. And so that's, so with Frankenstein and Frankenstein, the Bride of Frankenstein, and then if you take the notion that's sort of floating around today of the kind of post-racial America, then you say, well, whose idea is that? And what does that really mean? So, and anyway, so if we go back, this is the Great American Pinup book that I showed you. So one of the things that I do is like every place in every genre of image making that exists and that people find to be enjoyable or exciting or they're interested in, that doesn't carry a significant representation of black figures in it. I always do work like that to try and introduce into that ideal, to introduce the black figure as a representation. So I did a series of pinups, and this is one of them, but they're always different. They're not the same kind of cotton candy-like, over-sexy pinups that are the commonplace. And so this is a pinup that uses the black figure of a black woman riding on the Afro pick with the black power fist. The same thing, riding on the back of a Black Panther. So this is the flag for the Black Panther Party, but with the flag of black nationalism, the red, black, and green, as a kind of quilt-like, cobbled together from different kinds of fabrics with different patterns. I mean, these are all things that are inconsistent with the conventional representation of that image and with the conventional representation of the pinup as well. So these are the kinds of radical interventions, you would say, that I've been invested in. And one of the other things that I'm invested in, this is a drawing for the painting that follows, which is that painting, which is a portrait of John Punch. One of the other things I'm invested in is making representations of figures that have historical significance, but of whom there is no representation. And this would be John Punch, who was if you read in the history of black people in the United States, this was the figure around which the institution of slavery was really beginning to be codified in the late 17th century, where you find this is one of the first recorded instances that I've read about where you have differential treatment for black people and white people who commit the same crime. Where John Punch, who was an indentured servant, and two white guys who were indentured servants working for a guy ran away from the guy they were working from, and when they were caught, the two white guys had 3 more years added to their term of indenture, and John Punch was made to be a slave for the rest of his life. So that's differential treatment for the same offense. And the law started to change so that slavery in the United States was codified as a condition for black people and not for permanent slavery for black people and not permanent slavery for other people. So I think there ought to be images of people like this in the museum, so that when you go there and if you remember, we passed by a couple of images early on. It's like these kinds of images. Like, who is that guy down there in the lower right? It's like, I don't know. I don't know who he is. But if I go to see the painting in the museum, I'm going to look at the title and I'm going to find out who he is. And then there may be a card that explains something about him. But do I care who he is? Well, it's a nice picture. It's in the museum because it's a Titian painting. But do I really care who that person is? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. But I have to negotiate the fact that he is in the museum, whether I care about it or not. And so my thing is that you take somebody like John Punch, well, I don't care if people care who John Punch is really. But if you see that picture in the museum, then you have the opportunity to know and the opportunity to care. And just like I don't care so much about who that person in the Titian painting is, and people might not care so much about who the person in the John Punch painting is, it ought to be there anyway, because it's the opportunity to know that matters more than whether you actually care or not. And it's a good picture. so, but this is the terrain. This is what we're negotiating when we make artworks. These are the kinds of questions that we're trying to ask and to demand an answer to. How come I can have the Titian painting with a figure in it that I don't care anything about, and we can't have the John Punch painting in the museum with a figure that a lot of people may not care about? So that's where these are the terms of negotiation. The museum is not, as I would always say, the museum or any institution is not entitled to exist in an uncomplicated way in relationship to the audience that comes to view the work that's there. They are not entitled. And why should they be? We have there's as much at stake for us coming to see in what those museums are and become for us as an audience as it is for the people who work inside. So we should have something to say about that, because they're going to ask us to pay our admission at the door if it's a museum that you can't come in free. And they're telling us a story about the kinds of things that matter in the culture that we live in. And that is always to be contested. It is never to be accepted or taken for granted that because it's there, it ought to be there, and that because it's there, it is good. So this is another one. This is another painting in that kind of group where I'm trying to make pictures of people who are important, but there are no pictures of them. So this is a painting. The painting is titled, believed to be a portrait of David Walker. And most people are, David Walker, who the heck? And David Walker is this is another one of those free black men who put everything on the line to try and organize an insurrection to help overturn slavery. And he wrote a book called David Walker's Appeal to the Colored People of the Colored People of the World, and in particular of the United States, in which in 1834, I think it was, he wrote that pamphlet trying to define why black people were in the state they were in, all of the conditions that led to black people being the way they were, and also it was a critique of the Declaration of Independence, in which he outlined the hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence being written by people who themselves were slave owners. Now, when he had a clothing business in Boston, but the pamphlet he wrote trying to help incite this insurrection, he used to sew them into the lining of the clothes that he sold. And the black men who worked on some of the ships that would be coming in and they would go down south, they would take the clothes and would take the pamphlet and try to spread it into the South. But when the plot was found out, somehow David Walker turned up dead on his doorstep. But it's this idea that picture, to encounter that picture means to know something about David Walker. And so you try to make pictures that are compelling enough for people to be engaged and then to want to know more. And this is another one of those things, except this guy was a mass murderer. And so this is a case, it's called, I have sometimes these elaborate titles. But it's the actor Hezekiah Washington in his role as Julian Carlton, the Taliesin murderer. And I do that sometimes because I was really a big fan of ukiyo-e prints, and they used to do a lot of these prints of actors. And they've always been in their dramatic scene and often in their dramatic death scene. So anyway, let me move on. And then then the idea of the artist and what it means to be a painter, and the kinds of, and whether when we go to the museum we see representations of the artist representing himself. But this is also a fictional portrait of Scipio Moorhead, who we only know about because in the frontispiece to a book of poetry that Phyllis Wheatley did in 1772, I think it was, when it was published. First black woman to have a book of poetry published. Probably first woman in the United States to have a book of poetry published. She was a slave on the Wheatley plantation, but she learned how to write, how to read and to write, and they published. They had a book of her poetry published in. They couldn't publish it in the United States. They got it published and printed in England. And there's always this sort of controversy about whether or not she was capable of having written that poetry. And even Thomas Jefferson writes about it. If you read the notes on the state of Virginia that Thomas Jefferson, his notebooks, he talks about whether or not he believes that Phyllis Wheatley had the capacity to actually write this poetry. But she mentions in one of the poems this young African-American artist, this young black artist who made this image of her that they used in the frontispiece. And that's the only thing we know about him is that image. There are no other pictures. There's no other mention. He could be a figment of her imagination as far as we know. But that's what we know about him. So so this is a Scipio Moorhead portrait of himself, 1776, which is like right on the cusp of the American Revolution and the whole fight for independence. But, well, you got a slave who's sort of not part of that whole thing. So anyway, we'll move through that to a series of other paintings of painters. Because one of the things artists always do, and Rembrandt is sort of famous for it in a big way, is to do, the artists paint themselves. Sometimes they paint themselves at work painting, and oftentimes they just sort of use themselves as a vehicle for exercising some of their skill and craft and following the development of time. So I did a series of these painters who paint. They're bigger. There are other issues with these, but I'm not going to go into that too much because I don't want to talk a long time about stuff, and there's a lot more to show. A lot of stuff that I'm going to show that I'm not going to say anything about because it would just be too much. So I did a group of those, in which the palette figures prominently as another kind of representation, as an abstract field against the representational image. And these two paintings have, the painter making a painting, but it's the paint by number painting. So it's a paint by number painting, but in the picture they completely disregard. I mean, the painting is the painting that you're looking at that's being painted in the paint by number, but it completely disregards the rules of representation that the painting itself presents. And so the colors in the paint by number painting are arbitrary in the way they're dispersed. And then that's a curator, which I just found out. Like this is, I had a friend in Chicago. Her name was Beryl Wright. She was the curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, who committed suicide. She died, And this is a painting, sort of a memory of Beryl Wright. But I just found out that her brother came here to do a talk for the Gordon Park show that's up. I had no idea. And then those pinups again. And nude in the spotlight. And this is the first of a painting of a series of paintings that are called vignettes. Although that's only a vignette in the sense that it's a kind of a scene in what could be an extended narrative. But the other paintings take the form of the vignette more completely, which is this sort of image in a kind of hole, a kind of bubble, a kind of irregular shape, where the edges are not regular or they don't go out to the edge of the picture plane. And they're all these sort of romantic scenes, in grisaille, done in black and white, with the only colored note being those pink hearts that are floating up there. That's a drawing for that painting. And these are all, they're based in part on the Rococo as a genre in painting. And this notion that, one of the things that people disliked about the Rococo was this kind of overinvestment in sensuality, this kind of frivolous kind of subject matter, kind of pleasure principle that was being emphasized in the work. And after the French Revolution, those people were running for cover because those neoclassical people, when they got in, they were brutal, you would say. And then this work, which is a part of a suite of 5 paintings, which is essentially based on the Fragonard painting. You know that Fragonard did a painting called The Swing. You saw that in your... And this is where in that particular painting, the sensuality of the painting sort of arrives in the fact that the swing, you have the chaplain or the priest who's pushing the girl in the swing up over the bushes, but the girl's lover is hiding down in the bushes, and he pushes her out over there, over the bushes, so he can look under her dress when the swing goes out over him. That's the whole point of that painting. And so I did a suite of 5 paintings in which you see these figures in a 360-degree rotation. But the primary purpose is so that when you get around here, you just sort of look right up between that girl's legs in that view. And so this is the embodiment of what that Fragonard painting was about, but in a different manifestation, because it takes 5 paintings. This is 5 paintings in a rotation to be able to get that view. And so that's the other. And then there are a lot of other things sort of iconographically in the picture that are relevant, but I'm not going to I can't spend a whole lot of time talking about that. And that's the last one in that thing. And so it's more complicated than I want to go into. More of those. The drawing for that painting. And then some studies for each one of those figures. Another. Close up. And then, so those were all in grisaille, all done in black and white with just the pink hearts. And then I did some color. A couple of those I'll just go through. Where the vignette, instead of the image being done as a irregular shape that never goes to the edge, the shape is now defined by that pink that replaces the heart. So the hearts don't appear anymore, but the pink of the hearts now sort of comes in as this pink border, which helps define the vignette shape in the picture. So these pastoral landscapes. And then this is a new painting, it's a dark image. Anyway, but it's just another way of doing that vignette thing. And then, I don't know, there's a if you're following things that are going on, and maybe, because I'm so invested in the relationship between all of the things I do and what the overarching activity of the art world is. I do things that are in response to things sometimes. And the Studio Museum did a show 3 years ago called Black Romantic, in which this genre of work called black art was the featured idea for the show. And in this genre called black art, there are certain thematics that are always there when you see work by groups of artists, and it doesn't matter what city you find them in, whether they know each other or not, there's a consistency of concern and interest that these artists are all invested in and the kinds of images they make. And so this Black Romantic show was supposed to, in some ways, give those artists who never have a chance to show in any of the big museums, they're never invited to be in any of the group shows, they're never invited to be in anything because the work exists so far outside of what people consider to be fine art, to put that work in a museum so that it could get a critical savaging by the mainstream art critics, which would then sort of put those people on notice that they should stop asking to be included in stuff in these museums because their stuff never really makes the grade. And so I said, well, that's actually not the appropriate way to deal with that genre of work and with the people who make it. My thing is that if that work has some problems with criticality, that it is somehow deficient in the way in what it tries to accomplish, in the stakes that it sets, the proper response is not to dismiss that work, but to go into that work and find out if you can resolve whatever the deficiencies that work has and bring that work into the critical sphere so that it can operate at the same level that stuff people claim already has that kind of criticality operates at. So that's a challenge. It's to solve the problems that people have with a certain kind of work rather than simply dismiss it. And if we go back to those Rococo style paintings that I was showing, that nothing demonstrates this sort of way in which the kinds of things people do are dismissed out of hand operates. Then I was in France at Giverny, which Monet's house and compound and stuff, and there's a museum there. And I was doing a seminar with some graduate students from various places. And Yves Alembois, who knows who Yves Alembois is? He's like, this sort of modernist critic and art historian. And I was talking with him, and I was telling him while I was in Paris, I was going to go, I can't wait to go. I want to see all of these Boucher and Fragonard paintings, see all this Rococo stuff. And he said to me, why would anybody be interested in that? And that's, that thing, why would anybody be interested in that? Which presumes out of hand that there's nothing of value to be found there, and that there's nothing that can be done that might redeem whatever those deficiencies are in that work so that it can then become more productive and more useful for anybody in the state. This is like shutting off the possibilities for anybody to engage different kinds of works. And this is one of those problems that I think if you want to be an artist also, you're going to have to negotiate. And the way I look at it is that if there are people out there in the world who claim to know more about what you're trying to do than you do, then they will be able to say things like that to you and completely undermine and disrupt and disorient any of the plans you have for yourself. Because that kind of authority is destabilizing to any individual who has ambition to be a part of this thing that the authority claims to be over. And so you can't allow, you have to know more, or at least as much as they do, and you have to be really clear about your objectives in terms of what you're trying to make as an artist. Because if you are not, then you will be buffeted from side to side by any kind of comment like that anybody makes. And that's a recipe for oblivion, if there ever was one. And that's the thing. That's the position you end up in if you accept the notion that making art is about self-expression. Because in that equation where art is about self-expression, then you have to you accept that if people don't like what you do, either they are not seeing you clearly, or they're not empathizing with your. It's like they're not Bill Clinton feeling your pain. And if you're counting on people feeling your pain, for your success, I'm sorry, but you are in a world of trouble. So anyway, let me move on. So I started doing this work, and it's like you take what people call all of the familiar tropes, and a trope is just a kind of figure of speech, a mode of operating, a manner of doing, of these certain kinds of genres of paintings that nobody likes. And it's like if you go to the starving artist sales they do at the big convention houses, what is that? You can get the $39.95 oil painting that will fit over the sofa, and they're always the seascapes and they're the landscapes and it's like that stuff. You can buy them and you go to furniture stores and they have them hanging in there. So it's like, what's wrong with that work? Where is that work deficient? And what do you have to do to that work in order to resolve the inadequacies that work has so that it can then operate in the mainstream art world? Because in a way, that's all Andy Warhol did. That's all James Rosenquist did. That's all Roy Lichtenstein did. That's all those artists did, was that they took this popular forms that were outside what we consider to be the fine art world, and they found a way to bring those into the discussion about what kinds of things were relevant in the critical art world. And that thing, they called it pop art. And that's what Jeff Koons is doing on some level. So anyway, so I figured, the strategy is, let's go back. Let's not avoid that work, but let's go to that work. Let's go, actually, that's exactly where I'm going. This is stuff that people have already discredited. That's where I'm going. And then let's figure out if I can resolve, if I resolve that inadequacy, then I have actually done something that matters. If I can make people look at that work critically, then I've done something that really means something. And it means something in terms of the kinds of projects that artists can engage in, and with a degree of certainty that you will at least be a part of the discussion, whether people, and to do it whether people like it or not. Because the success of an artist has nothing to do with whether people like the work or not. And that's exactly the kind of work you want to make. You want to make work that they have to come to terms with, whether they like it or not, because the fact that work exists has changed the dynamics of the kinds of things that are relevant at a given time or a moment. So I did that one and another one. These are big seascape paintings. And one of the ways to start to do that is to start to make them of a size that makes it look like you're taking it seriously. So at 9 feet long, it looks like you're taking that seriously. So maybe I ought to look at that again and see what's going on. That's another black on black painting. So that's the best I can do with explaining that, because I can't there's a lot going on in there, but you got to be in front of the thing to really see it. That's it in a show. But all three of those things are things that I made. The sculpture, those prints on the wall, which are part of the Rhythm Master comic project, and the painting, and that's all a part of one installation at Mass MoCA in Massachusetts. So, and those photographs also work. So it's like when I show work, there's this phenomena amongst a lot of artists where you see one thing they made, you've seen them all, basically, because like one thing is kind of a variation on the other. That never interested me. I tend to make only enough of a kind of work to figure out how that kind of work needs to be made. And then once you understand how that kind of work is made, then you don't have to make that anymore. Then you go on to something else, and it's something else that you haven't quite mastered. And maybe part of that is because I've been overly influenced by Marcel Duchamp. When Duchamp said the studio should be like a laboratory, and that when an artist repeats himself, the only reason to continue to repeat yourself in a lot of cases is because there's commercial interest vested in that. You make more money repeating yourself and selling the same thing to a lot of people than you do making all these changes, over and over again. Now, this is a higher risk enterprise to keep changing up on people. But it's more interesting to keep doing this than it is to do the other thing. And to the degree that you can you invest the work with as much power as you can survive in the field without having to succumb to the temptation of doing this sort of incremental sort of shifts in the thing you do so that you can produce more work. But, on the other side of it, you don't get to drive the Ferraris and stuff. Like Jeff Koons is probably driving around in Porsches and Ferraris and all kinds of things. So anyway, I move on. And then so I'm going to go fast through this because this is just like across a range of things. Because I think we're running sort of short on time, right? We're getting kind of close. And we do want to have some kind of a Q&A after. But this is stuff that sort of gets earlier. And I'm going to arrive in a moment at two paintings that I say are really pivotal for me. This is all work that I was doing in the early 90s, a series of paintings called The Lost Boys that went with this big painting, which is called The Lost Boys. And this painting and the painting that follows, this painting called This Style, these two paintings are probably the most important, pivotal paintings I made in my development as an artist. So this was 1992, 1993, right around there. And these paintings, both of them are really big. They're 10.5 feet by 10 feet. And all of my ambition as an artist, everything that I had imagined myself being able to do as a painter came together in these two pictures. And at the moment that I made those pictures, everything changed for me. Because at that moment, I understood exactly what the stakes were, what my objective was, and how to go about fulfilling it. And I mean, on some level, in my egotistical self would say, after I made those two pictures, I never made another misstep. I was always clear. I had eliminated all the doubt about my ability to make the kinds of paintings that I always wanted to be able to make, that performed all of the functions that I thought a picture needed to perform. And it was realized in these two paintings. And in this painting, which was the first painting that was purchased by a museum of mine, was bought by the LA County Art Museum. And what was significant about that was the fact that when I went as an elementary school kid to the first museum, I didn't even know there was such a thing called a museum until they took us on that field trip. And that field trip was to the LA County Art Museum. And when I'm walking through there, I'm just saying, like, I want to be in here with these guys. You know, I want to have work that's in here like they have work in here. And when that painting was purchased by the LA County Art Museum, it fulfilled all my ambition as an artist because it was in there amongst all those other artists. And not only just in there, but it was in there on a scale and at a level that made it undeniable. You couldn't overlook it. So you don't walk past something like that and not know it's there. And the other thing is that the other thing that made this picture meaningful to me is that younger artists who went to the museum and saw that picture said to me, it's like, one artist in particular, I'm not going to name him, but he said, I read some interviews with you, and it's like the same stuff that you were saying in your interviews about how you felt when you were standing in front of Charles White's work at a museum. He said, that's the same stuff me and my friends are saying when we were standing in front of your picture. And so when you have a generation of young artists who find that there's something of use and something of value in the work that you made, and it gives them some kind of idea about how they can proceed, that's the greatest success you can have. Because all we're doing is trying to make work that not only connects with the past, but becomes a catalyst for what people who want to come after you are able to do. That's what we're trying to do as artists, because then you are completely embedded in the larger narrative of what it means to make important and significant artworks. So anyway, and it's like this other portrait thing. So Scouts. There's a Boy Scout and a Girl Scout. There's a suite of 5, too. There's a Boy Scout, a Girl Scout, a Cub Scout, and a Brownie. Then there's a Scoutmaster and a Den Mother in that group. And then the print, that's that print I made, that's 8 feet by 48 feet long. And then I printed that by myself. And it's in 12 colors. On the floor in my studio. And that's the thing, I just wanted, can I do it? I do it because I wanted to see if I could do it. And Anselm Kiefer was making some big prints, so I wanted to make a big print too. And my favorite print medium is linoleum cuts and wood cuts. I love the tactile quality you get with those two methods. I'm not a big fan of lithography per se, but why do you laugh? Is there a lithography teacher in here? Sorry, man. Okay, and then let me just run through these. So these are a series of paintings I did called the Garden Project. They were all based on housing projects in Chicago. They had garden as a part of their name. So I did them as a kind of pastoral. This is the painting that's at Johnston County Community College. And Johnston County Community College is one of the most remarkable places in the country. Because that community college has an outstanding permanent collection. It's like, where have you ever seen anything like that before? It's like there's nowhere else on the planet, I think, where there's a community college that has that kind of a collection. And the gallery they have there that's run by Bruce Hartman, it's like, man, that's world class. It's really unbelievable. And it's like the people he gets to come down there to show, it's like, that's remarkable. And that's within your neighborhood, sort of. So if you don't go down there, I would recommend going by there every now and then. So anyway, there were 5 of those pictures. So anyway, and you can see, there's a lot going on in there. but they're going at like 120 miles an hour, way too fast for that kind of road condition. And, every time they get to a curve, the tires are squealing. They go that, and they always, when they cut to that, the wheels in the movie, it's like you see the little gravel go off the edge. And so there's always this anticipation that the car is going to go over the side. But my notion of the amount of tension that you want to try to capture in a picture is that you take that same car and you have it squealing down the road, going to a curve, and you get it squealing up. It's up on two wheels, and it's just coming to the edge, and you stop, freeze that frame, except the wheels are still turning, and the sound is still going, and the person who's in the car gets out and walks off, and the car stays there with the sound and everything still going. It's like, can you get to that point where the picture is right on the edge of catastrophe, where for all intents and purposes, there's no reason why that picture should hold together, but because you're exerting so much force on it, it does. It all stays together. It doesn't just fly off the edge. It doesn't come apart. That's how you're trying to calibrate the tension within a lot of the work you're making. Because if you can do that, you can hold that anxiety and that tension and that stress right there, then that's a Herculean feat. All right. So anyway, let me. This is the Rhythm Master thing, which was first done at the Carnegie International in Pittsburgh, and it was done as a newspaper comic, which spawned this manifestation of it as called dailies, which is sort of based on the daily newspapers, daily newspaper comic strips. And the way in which it's like, even if you try to follow your daily comic strip in a newspaper, you always miss it some days, and so there are these gaps and inconsistencies in the through narrative. So in a form like this, it allows me to articulate the narrative in fragments, and non sequiturs. I could jump from one thing to another because there's there's nothing that requires me to be contiguous in the way I articulate the narrative. But it all starts in the primitive art wing, in the African art wing at the Art Institute in Chicago, and that's where this is set, where you have the African sculptor sort of breaking out. And then it ends up as a series of superheroes that are based on those African power figures that are in the museum, that are reanimated by rhythm patterns on the drum that are taught to a young man by the guy who is the rhythm master. And there are 5 of those the power figures, which I won't talk any about, but anyway. And it all took place against the backdrop of the demolition of public housing projects in Chicago. There's a delay there. Okay, I was trying to get. So that's one, a recent series of panels that are including this series of proposals I have for monuments for a new America. And in this case, you have a combined memorial. You take the Washington Monument and attach, since it's not likely they're going to build any new monuments on the mall for black freedom fighters. And so I think the only way you can do that, you have to attach the monuments to black freedom fighters to the Founding Fathers monuments. And so I've attached the monument to Nat Turner onto the Washington Monument. And it explains in the legend down there how it sits on there. You can see in the inset, this is what it is. It's Nat Turner as the avenging angel. And this is part of the idea that the Founding Fathers are not entitled to have uncompromised monuments to their greatness. They are not. And so these are propositions for that. So I'm going to do all of the monuments. And then I'm not going to talk about that because there are not enough things in that group to make it work. But I do these T-shirt offers in the comic strip. It's like you always find T-shirt offers in comic books. And then I did at the Wexner Center in Ohio, there's a Bunraku puppet show, which is a Japanese-style puppet performance. It's a very particular kind of performance style that's really just amazing. And so I developed these puppets to do that show, and they just went on display after the performance. The puppets went on display as just objects in the case. That's the set. Some of the puppets. Another series of paintings, and I'm going to just speed through this and not talk about them. But except to say that I did a group of paintings that were kind of requiem for the 1960s as a decade. In particular, the way culture and politics kind of came together to create the decade, which was really a defining moment in American life and history. And all of the people who were pictured in these paintings died between 1959 and 1970, which were the dates that bracket the 1960s. And in this case, you have blues, R&B, and jazz musicians, and it starts with Billie Holiday, who died in 59, and Jimi Hendrix, who died in 1970. And it's like when you take a roll call of all these people who died in that period, it is such an incredible pantheon of people. Just unbelievable. And this painting is over at the Nelson Atkins. That was the closure on that group of Mementos paintings. This painting was closure, so to close the curtains on the whole thing. And this is an installation of the show that those were in at the Renaissance Society with the sculpture, the stamp pads down there, and those prints on the wall were the prints that were made from the plates on the bottom of those pads, and these are the prints. And these are all 5 slogans that were really popular during the 1960s, Black liberation struggle and the Civil Rights movement. And if you read them as a complete sentence, it's like the whole one thing follows another. And the sentence, so you start with black is beautiful, and then what follows that is black power. And how do you want black power? With black power, we shall overcome, and we shall overcome by any means necessary. And what means might that require? Well, burn, baby, burn. It's like you take all of that. And then another series of souvenirs based on the 16th Street Baptist Church. That's the vase. It's a commemorative plastic, vacuum-formed plastic vase based on the sign on the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. It's a replica of it, but as a kind of memorial vase with these plastic flowers. And the title of the piece is As Seen on TV, which is what that little card on the shelf down there says. And then some photographs. I did a series of black light photographs. Black Christmas in black light, bottle tree. We're coming to the end. That picture is backwards, although the title of the photograph is black because it's a photograph of the Johnson's Publishing Building taken at night from Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. And those words are ebony and jet. And ebony is a black wood and jet is about as black as you can get. So taken at night, you end up with a black photograph. So, and that actually was a part of a larger piece that was based on Donald Judd's work, but the photograph exists kind of independently as well. So anyway, these last photographs, so this closes out. There's a photograph of my neighbor's Cadillac. He's passed away now, but he was a man who was in his late 70s, used to sit out on the porch next door from time to time, but he'd come out with his revolutionary vest. He had this vest he used to put on in the morning, come out, and it was all these buttons from the Black Panther buttons and anti-apartheid buttons and Steve Biko buttons, all this stuff, and then it's Cadillac with the black nationalist flag and an American flag on the antenna. So I thought that was funny, was nice, and that was a part of a constellation of photographs called The Art of Hanging Pictures. And this one hung on the wall from a long cord at an angle, sideways. But there were about 12 photographs that were part of that installation. So anyway, that's the end of the presentation. And so from that, you sort of get a sense of, this is like the scope of what I've been involved in, and that the reasons why the scope of what I'm doing is so broad is because I think as you should think, that you should be the one who determines how you participate in the game of making art, and that you should know when you set out that you have a better than 50% chance of succeeding in exactly the ways that you imagine yourself being able to succeed. And the only way you can do that really is to know everything that can be known to you in your lifetime about how images work, and what kinds of uses they can be put to, and what the people who are going to assess them critically are likely to think and say about them. You have to know that ahead of time, so that, and everything you do, to me, is self-consciously strategic, because it's designed to get you exactly where you want to go and to allow you to have exactly the kind of life in the arts that you really want to have. And I've been fortunate enough to have been able to do everything that I've done in the art world on my terms. And part of that has to do with the fact that before I even went to art school, I thought I knew a thing or two. And when I showed up at places, I showed up and I acted like I belonged there, and I talked like I knew what I was talking about, and so people had to come to terms with that. I didn't do the thing that a lot of people used to do. This whole networking thing, which is why a lot of people say you should go to school because you get networks and stuff like that with your friends. No, that's not the reason. That doesn't work. Because often what happens with that kind of networking is you just got a bunch of people commiserating about how much they're all being left out of the same thing. And so you don't want to get into a group where there are a bunch of people patting each other on the back saying everybody's stuff is okay, and neither one of you are moving a step further forward on the path that you want to move. It's not about networking and stuff. It really, on some level, it's really about an individual engagement with the entire history of visual production. And the degree that you will be successful, I think, in a lot of ways, has to do with how deeply invested in the transformation of the narrative from all the way back to the future that you were invested in. So with that, I think I'm going to shut up and open the floor to some questions if you'd like to ask some. Thank you.